And now Jupiter in the 11th house in Gemini. So in this video, we're going to go over the ins and outs of exactly what Jupiter in the 11th house Gemini symbolizes. And to look at it in a real world situation is extremely important. So we will use the birth chart of Muhammad Ali to help us in that regard. Understanding a planet in a sign and a house is a three-step process. First of all, understand the planet in the house. Like, what does Jupiter in the 11th house represent? Second of all, understand the planet in the sign. Like, what does Jupiter in Gemini represent? And third of all, the consequences to the lordship interpretations as a result of the planet being in that house and sign. That one's a little bit more complicated, but when we get to it, it'll become clear. So to start off at step one, what does Jupiter in the 11th house symbolize? That's what we looked at in depth in the first episode of this series. I'll put a link to that in the description below if you want to know all the nuances of it. But the summary is that Jupiter in the 11th house signifies being wealthy, being a performer, and being non-authoritarian. Now put that aside for a second, because it's not what Jupiter in Gemini in the 11th house necessarily symbolizes, but it's a part of it. The next part is, what does Jupiter in Gemini signify? So again, I've already done a video on Jupiter in Gemini. I'll put a link to that if you want to explore the nuances of it. The summary is that Jupiter in Gemini symbolizes having mercurial traits, likability, and non-dominance. Now, mercurial traits is open-ended because Mercury represents different types of things, but it would depend upon the conditions. But it could include anything like being communicative, being witty, being funny, being organized, stuff like that. So now we're almost ready to look at Jupiter in Gemini in the 11th house, but we just have to think about the lordships that are necessitated by this combination. But to explain that, if Gemini is the 11th house, then Jupiter's signs, Sagittarius and Pisces, must be the 5th and the 8th. So if Jupiter is in Gemini in the 11th house, it means that the 5th lord is in the 11th house and the 8th lord is in the 11th house, and that's significant, and we should try to interpret that. So the 5th house symbolizes intellect and affection. The 8th house is scrutiny and sexuality, and the 11th house is talent and profit. So figure out how these things resonate with each other, how they line up. For example, intelligence and talent pretty well lines up, so it's going to highlight being talented and being intelligent, but it's going along with scrutiny. Scrutiny is also mixed in there and kind of aligning with intelligence. So intelligent and talented, especially in knowing where a mistake is, or where a flaw is, or where an opening is. Also, the 5th house is attractive, the 8th house is sexual, and the 11th house is pleasurable. So these people are sexually viable, and they're attractive people. So now that we've done all three steps, we just have the final step, which is to synthesize all three. For example, Jupiter in the 11th is a performer. Jupiter in Gemini is also talented, and the 5th and the 8th lords in the 11th house is also talented. So it's hitting on all three. That if Jupiter is in Gemini in the 11th house, we're getting a lot of assurance that the native has performance ability of a mercurial quality. So we can say they're a dexterous performer, or they're at least very skilled or balanced or detailed in how they perform. You can also see a synergy going on in that Jupiter in Gemini is likable, and the 5th and 8th lords in the 11th house is attractive. So they're highly likable and relatable, attractive in a relatable way. Also, Jupiter in the 11th house is inherently non-authoritarian, and the 8th lord, especially in the 11th house with the 5th lord, has that ability to find flaws. So people with Jupiter in Gemini in the 11th house, it would be difficult to lie to them. It would be difficult to trick them or bluff them, because they see through your charades. They see the mistakes that you made. Now that's the template of the basic understanding of what Jupiter in Gemini in the 11th house represents. Whether or not you have it or you feel that this matches you or something is a different story. Not because the template is in any way deficient, but because the way the template works is to be put into practice in your whole chart. And the conditions of your chart have an enormous impact on how any particular part of the chart will play out. So this is why in the next part of this video, what I want to do is look at a real chart and see how it plays out for this person, which is probably not exactly the same way that it will play out for anybody else that also has Jupiter and Gemini in the 11th house. For example, Muhammad Ali has Jupiter in Gemini in the 11th house. He's definitely not non-dominant, is he? Even though Jupiter in Gemini has that quality. But you can see how, although he's a boxer, he has all these mercurial qualities to his excellence in boxing and also in general. Quite linguistic for a boxer. And now you can also see an example of what we're talking about where the intelligence works in a way that you're difficult to bluff and where you can find the openings in an opponent. If you're fighting with Muhammad Ali, you wouldn't be able to trick him into moving a certain way, whereas another boxer you might be able to. Or if you let your guard down, he's going to find it very quickly. So obviously Muhammad Ali is a great boxer. Does that mean that you should be a great boxer since you have Jupiter and Gemini in the 11th house? No, it's all about the whole chart and how that whole chart works together with a particular component. For example, look at Muhammad Ali's 10th house. It has both the malefics in it, Saturn and Mars. So none of the soft potentials of Jupiter in the 11th house are highlighted by this or supported by this. So it's not like artistic or expressive. That doesn't become his primary trait. His primary trait is he's tough. And you wouldn't get that interpretation from only looking at Jupiter and Gemini in the 11th house. But if you look at the whole chart, you see it right away. Because he has two malefics in the 10th house alone. And Saturn is his 6th lord. And that 6th lord is also very tough. Furthermore, Saturn is also the 7th lord, which means that he has a house exchange between 7 and 10. Also, Muhammad Ali is the father of 9 children. Sure, we saw a bit of that in how Jupiter in the 11th house Taurus is attractive and fruitful, but it is definitely beneficial to fathering and mothering to have the 5th lord in the 11th house. But what's really going on with his Jupiter as the 5th lord in the 11th house is precisely trine to his moon. So that's very good for fertility. Furthermore, the lordships involved in the moon and Jupiter thing also is very good for fertility because the moon in his case is the 12th lord and Jupiter is the 8th. So I think you can see how it's really the most important part of the education after you learn the theories has to be put into practice. You never abandon the theories, but you never use them straight out of the box either. You see how the theory works in a particular setting. It's very similar to how you can have 2 of the same seeds, but if you give them to 2 different farmers, they produce 2 very different results. In the same way, 2 charts may have the same condition in them, but the interpretations and the outcome in the person's lives will be very different. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara Bala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.